Over 10 years ago, I bought my lovely mother the Oppo Find 7 from the X8 developer conference, and she absolutely loved it. Of course, Oppo have been producing phones since then, but in recent years they've not been in the UK and European markets. And today we're looking at the Oppo Find X8 Pro, which goes toe-to-toe, at least on paper, with the likes of Apple, Samsung, OnePlus, Google, Honor, Xiaomi, among a few others. So in this review you can see if it's actually worth its price tag, because in the UK and at the time of filming it can be found for roughly £950 to £1,050. So let's kick things off and talk about its design. And really, I'm not too fond of it. It's kind of got an uninspiring look with its kind of circular shape at the top with the cameras, and then you've got this pearl white model which almost looks like it's got water damage. Indeed, it's very much fitting with the name, but the pearl effect, in my opinion, really doesn't suit a smartphone. Now, of course, you can get rid of this by opting for the space black model instead, which kind of gets rid of this effect. Now, nonetheless, no matter which finish you go for, you'll find that the back is pretty nicely textured and doesn't suffer from any fingerprints. But make no mistake, it's still actually quite slippery with that aluminium frame, so you might want to actually attach a case to it. Now, if you don't, the phone weighs in at 215 grams, and the manufacturer says it's delightfully light. Not sure about that because it's still actually pretty chunky. You have also got an 8.25mm thickness, so it's actually pretty thin. Now, in terms of the buttons on the right-hand side, they're absolutely excellent. They've got a really nice feel to them and they feel pretty premium. Now, I also love the fact that you have got the quick button, which has got haptic feedback and is used to open up the camera. It's an excellent inclusion. You can slide to zoom and even hold it down to initiate burst photos. It would have been better if it was actually a little bit positioned more towards the edge of the smartphone, making it a little bit easier to grip. But nonetheless, its inclusion is very much appreciated. Speaking of which, I really love the fact that you have got a mute toggle. Yes, it even mutes the audio playback if you're actually currently listening to it. And this, in my opinion, is quite a novelty on Android smartphones. iPhone users will say, well, we've had this for absolutely years. Sure, but when it comes to the Android world, it's something that I haven't really noticed. And in this respect, I do think it's a fantastic inclusion because it means you can quickly mute your audio or go on to vibrate without actually having to worry about faffing around with the settings. Now, speaking of audio, you have got stereo speakers, which are actually really impressive. You've got a really immersive sound with decent bass reproduction. And in this respect, when it comes to consuming media or, for example, playing games, I had no issues whatsoever. But it is worth mentioning over here that there is no 3.5mm jack, very much that is come to be expected in modern smartphones. But nonetheless, if you do want to route audio via the smartphone, you have got the USB Type-C port. Now, moving on from the aesthetics, let's talk about its display. And here it's protected with Gorilla Glass 7i, where some people will argue that it doesn't give you the flagship performance in terms of scratch resistance in comparison to some of the other phones out there. Nonetheless, here I had no issues whatsoever when it came to my usage, although it's worth mentioning over here that my phone came with a pre-applied screen protector, although it was slightly damaged, so I actually removed it altogether. Now, the display itself is absolutely immaculate. You've got a 6.78-inch 120Hz AMOLED display with Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus support. It runs at a resolution of 1264 by 2780. It's absolutely beautiful and it's got excellent viewing angles as well. It also does get actually pretty bright, where I recorded a peak of 800 nits, and it gets all the way down to 1.93 nits, so therefore giving good sort of range, both for using it in a bright sunlit condition or even in a completely pitch black environment. It also does support PWM dimming with 2160 Hz, and this actually operates at under 70 nits, so therefore you might want to utilize this in very dark scenarios. Now, I should also mention you have also got an optical fingerprint sensor which is under the display. It's fast, but it's not exactly the fastest. Thankfully, you can actually pair this up with face unlock, and therefore means that the phone is not only very fast to operate, but also pretty secure. Now, while that's all very impressive, what really stands out to me is its camera configuration, specifically at the back. You have got 4 lenses, a 50MP f1.6 wide with OIS, a 50MP f2.6 periscope telephoto with 3x optical zoom and OIS, another 50MP f4.3 telephoto with 6x optical zoom and OIS, and a 50MP f2.0 ultra wide. Now, the combinations of all of these four actually results in absolutely phenomenal and jaw-dropping results. Sure enough, it's going to compete with some of the flagship offerings out there on the market, but in this respect, Oppo have done an excellent job. The overall skin tones look pretty natural. The colours didn't seem to be overly saturated, nor did they lack that sort of vibrancy and therefore seemed a little bit dull. And also the overall HDR experience, and definitely here when it comes to the dynamic range that is offered, it looks all very good. Here, I also was very impressed by the ability of going with 6 times optical zoom and up to 120 times digital zoom. In fact, if you're going to be zooming in, you'll find that AI photography kicks in from 60 times, and therefore means that it does give you an artificial reproduction of what you might be able to see, but some people will appreciate that because it clears up the image as such. Of course, you can disable AI photography altogether if you so wish, so you don't actually have to rely on something that's artificial. Now, nonetheless, over here, I just must say that I'm not really taken back with what Oppo have been able to achieve. The sensors that have gone for, the configuration of the apertures, and just generally how the software reacts is just absolutely incredible. I think a lot of people will be left absolutely jaw-dropped. Furthermore, low light photography is also pretty good. I don't think it's really up there with the utmost flagship phones out there on the market, but it still does a really good job in drawing out a lot of detail. And yes, even in terms of the ultra-wide lens, you're getting plenty of detail and a decent amount of light. It will look a little bit more softened in comparison to the main camera lenses, and the zoom lenses will unsurprisingly give you a little bit of noise, but still in this respect, even in very low light conditions, the camera configuration do a really good job. Now, it's also worth pointing out over here that there is a macro mode, and here it really left me jaw-dropped. I think it's something that a lot of people will completely forget, and more often than not, macro lenses or the ability to have a macro shot just doesn't result in a good reproduction. However, hopefully you'll be able to agree with me that these shots that were shot with the macro mode enabled just look absolutely incredible. You can see the finite amount of detail, yes, including the damage on this Tesla Model S that I'm currently reviewing for Totally EV. The overall detail that you're able to attain is just fantastic. And again, flagship offerings out there will offer you similar degree of performance, but it's just great to see it on this Oppo device. Now, there is also burst photography, which is also pretty good and snappy. You can also use that little shortcut button as well to take burst photos, and the manufacturer labels this as lightning snaps for fast moving shots. It does a pretty good job from my own tests, and while I don't exactly have a lot of samples to go by, I can just say that it just does exactly what it says on the tin. So overall over here, everything does actually work pretty well. Now, as for the selfie camera, you've got a 32 megapixel f2.4. It does a really good job, and I was actually left pretty impressed in low light conditions. See here, you can activate a flash function, which will come to no surprise to a lot of individuals on a lot of phones out there, specifically more premium phones out there, because it basically lights up your screen and gives you a little bit more of a light condition. But when it comes to practice, sometimes some phones actually just struggle, specifically when it comes to skin tones. Sure enough, it looks a little bit white, but at the same time, these pictures were taken in very low light conditions. And hopefully you can see the differences over here, that it does really do a good job. As for portraits, yet again here I was left pretty impressed, not only in normal lighting conditions, but also in low light photography. Yet again, the camera does an excellent job of giving me a pretty accurate tone. Now, I'd also like to highlight that the stock camera app does give you good editing functions. They are pretty comprehensive and pretty intuitive to use, and you've got the AI editor, which can be handy. For example, the AI eraser. Although it is kind of hilarious in certain scenarios as to what it actually offers. If you see this actually in motion, you'll see that on the Tesla Model S with a screen, it replaces it with physical buttons, which I'm sure some people will appreciate, and then the steering wheel is replaced with an old school steering wheel. Sure, in these sort of scenarios, it might look a little bit funny how AI is actually interacting with the image, but in more realistic scenarios where, for example, you're taking out, let's say, a duck on a pond, or like, let's say, a dustbin in the background, or a person on a beach, then it does do a decent job. I don't think it's up there with some of the other AI editors within smartphones, but yet again over here, I think a lot of people will be left impressed. As for the enhanced clarity mode, I do think it's a little bit redundant given the camera quality that you're getting. In some ways, it's testament to the lenses that Oppo is offering. It also takes quite a while to process, and I just don't think most people will be using it. But sure enough, if you feel that you've got a little bit of a blurry shot, then feel free to whack this on, to get a little bit of extra sharpness from your shots. Now, still photography is certainly very impressive, but what about when it comes to videos? Well, here, yet again, I've been left pretty impressed. The stabilization is really excellent. Sure enough, there are some other phones out there that will do a little bit of a better job, namely, for example, the likes of the Apple devices, but still here with OIS that's present on 3 out of the 4 lenses, and just as a reminder, the ultra-wide doesn't offer it, it really does come in handy, specifically when you pair this up with EIS as well. That's electronic image stabilization combined with optical image stabilization. Now at the rear, you'll be able to shoot 4K 60 and 30 FPS, 1080p 30, 60, 240, and also at 720p you can shoot 240 and even 480. Note, it's worth pointing out over here in the high speed modes that 3 times zoom is only available at 240 FPS. Now, in terms of the overall image quality, it does a really decent job. I do think here in low light photography, it does struggle a little bit, and it's not exactly as good as some of its key competitors. But combining this with the stabilization that is on offer, and bearing in mind over here, these tests were done without the ultra steady mode enabled, which effectively gives you a little bit of a cropped image, but therefore gives you extra bit of stabilization like you'd find on some action cameras out there. The overall image and therefore video recording capabilities are pretty impressive. At the back, it even shoots 10-bit video with Dolby Vision, which is even better credentials for you shooting in HDR and therefore having the ability of reproducing these not only via the display itself, but also if you're going to be sharing or using it for more professional usage. However, what isn't as impressive is the selfie camera when it comes to video recording capabilities. It's not because the selfie camera kind of struggles in low light conditions, but rather that the autofocus doesn't seem to be available. And from what I did some research, I noticed that autofocus is not present on the front-facing camera, which I think is a really missed trick, because if you're going to be, let's say, video calling someone and you're panning around, then the autofocus doesn't seem to pick it up. I actually noticed it myself and I found it a little bit odd, only for me to realize actually this is a feature that is missing and some people will actually be looking forward to it. Nonetheless, over here, when it comes to the resolution and frames, well, it does get pretty high. You can shoot 4K 60 with the selfie camera as well. And when it comes to normal lighting condition, it is actually pretty decent yet again. Now, to power the cameras and to give you that processing capabilities, the manufacturer has teamed up with Mediatek to give you a 3nm Dimensity 9000. This gives you an octa-core CPU and an Immortalis G925 GPU. You've also got 16GB of RAM to play around with. The combination means that you've got a really fluid experience when it comes to launching different apps, multitasking, or of course, gaming. Now, when it comes to my benchmarks, it did a tremendous job. In Geekbench Syncs with the single core performance coming at 2,941 and multi-core at 8,536. As for GFX Bench, it had a minimum of 43 FPS and a whopping 391 at its peak. Yes, some of these graphs will look a little bit skewed towards the Oppo because the alternatives here that I'm comparing it to are mid-range to budget phones, but nonetheless, even comparing it toe-to-toe with some of its competitors, it does an absolutely excellent job. Ultimately over here, the Oppo Find X8 Pro is an absolute powerhouse, be it for light or hardcore gaming. The only caveat that I should note is that I did notice a little bit of extra heat. Now, this didn't actually come while I was gaming. Oddly, it was just when I was coming to browsing or just using the phone generally, suddenly the phone would randomly heat up. I'm not really sure why, and upon looking it up, I found that some other owners had noticed similar behavior. Now, this could be due to firmware, this could be just due to how the chipset is operating and the heat dissipation, but just something I thought I should share in this review. Equally, what I found quite shocking was that my phone was sometimes crashing, and by that I mean even Google services crashed and forced closed when I was setting up the phone for the very first time. Not great on first impressions, Oppo. Yes, this might actually throw off certain individuals and might even put off certain individuals from getting the phone. I just wanted to check if it was a certain use case of my Press device being sent to me and potentially having had some odd configuration in the past. But lo and behold, when I did a bit more research and dug into forums, I suddenly found that some other users were also having similar issues. And even they went to the lengths of hard resetting their smartphone, which in my opinion is completely inexcusable. This is not talking about the Oppo Find 7 from 2014. So Oppo, really sort out your software, because this really should not be happening on a device that costs upwards of £950. And this will look like the competitors offer a far better Android experience. Nonetheless, apart from some of these issues which happened intermittently, I actually found that the software, which was ColorOS 15, which is built upon Android 15, did actually do a pretty good job. It's worth noting over here that you'll have 5 years worth of updates, therefore taking you up to Android 20 technically. And while that doesn't offer you as much as some of its competitors like the likes of Google or Samsung, I still think that's plentiful. In 5 years' time, you're likely going to be upgrading the phone, but even if you're not, I still think that's plenty of time to use Android. Now here, there is plenty of customization within ColorOS, but there is a little bit of bloatware for my liking, and you've got certain AI features such as a transcribe function, which is pretty useful for recordings, and even the assistant, which can be used with notes. Handy in certain scenarios, but I appreciate not everyone's going to be using them. What you might use, however, on a day-to-day basis is the smart sidebar. This can be just swiped across from the right-hand side, and yes, this is present on other smartphones and on the Android operating systems, but still I found it pretty responsive and customizable. You can also launch some of the AI features directly from the smart sidebar, therefore allowing easier degree of productivity and also interaction with the smartphone. Now, with all that power, you might be wondering, what about when it comes to the all-important battery life? Well, here you've got a 5910 milliamp silicon carbon battery. And from my controlled benchmarks, it netted a very impressive 28 hours and 11 minutes. Now, bearing in mind this graph is comparing it with some cheaper alternatives, but in comparison to its like-for-like rivals, it does actually go toe-to-toe with them. Of course, there's some out there that will perform a little bit better, but in the grander scheme of things, you should expect roughly 1 to 2 days of light to medium usage. If you're a heavy mobile gamer, roughly expect 1 day of usage. Now here you can also quickly recharge the battery because you've got 88 watts of charging capacity over the USB Type-C ports. You've also got 50 watts of wireless charging capabilities and 10 watts of reverse charging capabilities. Now that's actually pretty impressive, and therefore means that if you do want a quick bit of extra juice, then you'll be able to attain that before heading out of the house. Now, another thing that I found was pretty rapid was when it comes to connectivity. It's got fast Wi-Fi with Wi-Fi 6 and 7, Bluetooth version 5.4 with a whole host of codecs, which is certainly appreciated for audiophiles, with the likes of LHDC5, aptX and LDAC among the SBC and AAC codecs. And also you've got NFC, which could come as almost no surprise. As for the USB port, which is a Type-C, it's also got the 3.2 standard, therefore giving you good fast transfer speeds. Now on that note, you have got 512 gigabytes of internal storage. That should be absolutely plentiful for a lot of individuals. However, it is worth noting over here that you've got not an expandable storage to choose. Now, aside from that, the phone itself is IP68 and IP69 certified, which not only means that it's immersible for 30 minutes for a depth of 1.5 meters, but it also will survive water jets. If for some given reason you're washing your car and just end up power hosing the phone, then just know that it will survive. Now, on a more realistic note, I feel that the haptics are absolutely excellent. I think it's one of the best that I've ever come across on a smartphone. Oppo call this O haptics, and even the little demo that you get via the settings just makes it feel really accurate. It doesn't have that springy, cheap feeling like you'd find on some rival alternatives, and therefore if you like using haptics, then I really do love the fact that here Oppo have thought about you, and therefore it's something that you might want to enable via the settings. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the Oppo Find X8 Pro. And here the manufacturers really come back with a bang, competing with some of its key rivals. Although some people will argue and say that there's some other alternatives out there that you might want to consider, specifically given its overall price point. And yes, indeed, they wouldn't be wrong. There are certain limitations that I've highlighted throughout this review, and hopefully you've cottoned on to them in the respect that, for example, the selfie camera lacks the autofocus, the low light photography in certain areas can be a bit improved, and also the software optimization is a little bit poor, and therefore can be polished. Thankfully, this can be done over the air, and with future firmware updates, even in terms of Android itself, this can also be addressed. Now, with that in mind, can I see myself recommending it? Well, absolutely, because it really does perform very well across the board and has left me very impressed. As a result of this, it gets my Best Buy award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below and how you feel it compares with some of its key competitors. Now, if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.